Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Championed as a voice for the Global South, the BRICS grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa aims to promote an alternative to a world order that's been traditionally centered around Western powers. The bloc will soon host its 15th annual summit in Johannesburg, South Africa, where many topics like BRICS expansion, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and group financial cooperation will be on the table. In today's special program, BRICS Rising South with a Stronger Voice, we've invited experts and scholars from the 5 BRICS countries to analyze the role of BRICS in the rising global South. They are José Ricardo, Júnior, CEO of LIDE China and researcher at the BRICS Study Group of the University of São Paulo, Andrey Kortunov, academic director of the Russian International Affairs Council, Atul Dalakoti, center founder of the BRICS Center for Economic Cultural Research and Services, Professor Huang from Shanghai International Studies University, and Professor Paul Zilungisele Tembe from the University of South Africa. That's our topic. I'm Xu. Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. So, Huang, I will start with you. We know that many would say this upcoming summit is one of the most important meetings of BRICS grouping. Tell us, what's the particular significance of this conference?
I think never before have the developing countries, especially Global South, represented by this BRICS, been so important for our life, either from the perspective of politics or economy or even social development. First. And second, we know that this is a moment that the Global South has really taken a serious position in global peace and stability, especially at the time of Ukraine war or Ukraine conflict. We know that when this war started, over 141 countries in the United Nations has condemned the aggression or this special military operation conducted by Russia. But when the United States decided to launch a full-scale sanction against Russia, the entire Global South did not join in to this date. That was quite a statement for the attitude and position taken by the Global South on this very important issue, given its significance to today's peace. And economically speaking, it is inevitable that the Global South, especially the BRICS countries, would be increasing the presentations in the world. This kind of momentum will create a new situation in which the so-called West will no longer be able or allowed to dominate in the global affairs. And the BRICS countries, the 5 of them, despite all the differences, will play a much bigger role in global affairs. And this summit is right at this moment. That's why it shows global attentions. I deserve it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Atul Dalakoti, you are nodding your head. So we have this new situation, and then, of course, one of the important topic among the discussions is the expansion of this grouping. Do you think it's a time for this group to expand?
I think membership expansion has become a very important discussion in the BRICS, and this would be reflected in this very important meeting that we are going to have in South Africa. The list of member states that want to join is quite long. There is a healthy discussion among the present 5 countries who have all to agree on the expansion. I feel all the countries are committed to expansion of the members, but there are certain differences on the approach and the speed that it could be done. It's a great opportunity for leaders to meet together and talk in details on this very important topic. Expansion has its own challenges, as all decisions have to be agreed by all members. So it is important to have a common program on which all the new members are committed to. This is going to be the challenge going forward. That's my personal opinion.
Mr. Andrey Kortunov, so there's a consensus, can we say, for the grouping to expand again, after South Africa joined the group in 2010, more than, basically 13 years ago. So there are different opinions on the speed, on like how far it will go, as many countries are now waiting in the line to join this group.
Well, let me start with saying that it is natural for any institution to expand. It is natural for NATO, for the European Union, for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the BRICS is clearly not an exception from the overall rule. Right now, when we're talking about BRICS, I think it is particularly important to define what kind of countries are going to be considered first. Because, for instance, they might decide that they need a Middle East country to join BRICS because so far Middle East is not present. And it might be Iran, it might be Saudi Arabia, or they would think that they need another member coming from the Southeast Asia or another member from Latin America. I don't think that they will consider too many candidates because that might overload the institution, but they can definitely consider a couple of potential new member states.
Professor Tembe, as a hosting country, South Africa, do you think there's, like a set of rules or criteria agreed upon by the existing members in terms of accepting new members? There are some countries people will see, yes, they are natural part of this global south, for example, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Argentina, for example, Iran, even Turkey. So what are the criteria?
There are two sides of the story, but they all go in parallel. Remember that each and every BRICS member state has got BRICS plus nations around it. Those ones have served as an experiment, if so to say. For example, in the case of South Africa, we've had the customs union around BRICS plus countries. So we've seen where BRICS works, not only as a brand, but in the implementation of BRICS resolutions. So we have that part of it. They already see functioning BRICS plus momentum. And then is the question of power as well. It is obvious that we will allow or encourage that Saudi Arabia joins, because when Saudi Arabia comes in, then it's another impetus. It's an oil-producing country, it's one of the giants, and we already have 5 oil-producing countries in the member states that are applying to join the BRICS. So we've got 2. It's going to be regional in accordance with the BRICS plus momentum, and we're going to look at powers, something that will add more value to BRICS at this moment. As we spoke about it, all of us was agreeing that it's a paradigmic shift, a momentum that might even change the manner in which we do business. You already see the Shanghai Cooperation. You already see the accumulation of gold bullions all over the world. So something is in the making here. But in terms of joining BRICS, we are going to go for power and the tested waters. I think that is what I see at the moment.
Mr. Ricardo, we know that there are about 40 countries expressing interest to join this grouping, and about 22, more than half of them, have officially submitted application to join BRICS. So what makes this grouping so attractive to these large developing countries?
Definitely, the BRICS, although it's not an economic bloc, it's an alliance which cooperates politically, economically, and financially. And we are seeing that this Global South platform is gaining muscles and is gaining voice. So these countries that are willing to join the BRICS are willing to have more voice in the world in terms of the reform of governance, an inclusive multilateralism, and etc. And to make the most of it, the BRICS must promote the economic transformation, deepening the inclusive and balanced development. And for that, BRICS does common criteria and procedures, gradually forging consensus, promoting the establishment of broader partnerships, and facilitate common development and prosperity on large scale. Undoubtedly, the BRICS has a legitimacy and a voice to play a greater role in global governance, as well as inclusive multilateralism and economic, cultural, social, and political world development. The BRICS cooperation to promote this economic transformation is based on beneficial cooperation and equal respect upon the development of these three pillars, which are the technology, innovation-driven, the sustainability, and inclusiveness. Definitely, when we talk about BRICS, this BRICS Plus, the proposal meant to widen this friends circle of BRICS, to turn BRICS into the most influential platform for the South-South cooperation, this cooperation that is among the developing countries of the Global South, and open up, in the end, a brighter future for the economic development and social progress of all developing countries. I just want to add that it's important, for sure, to make the use of this BRICS Plus cooperation model and explore to more levels in more areas and in a wider scope. But we have to discuss about how is going to be the criteria to accept, in the end, to accept these countries that are eager to join the BRICS.
Mm-hmm. Huang, of course, BRICS will offer, the potential candidates countries a platform, for them to express their opinions, to have their voice better heard, or probably better cooperation with other developing countries like, India, China, Russia, South Africa, Brazil. Then beyond that, what benefits they are expecting out of their membership?
I think first and foremost, we have to know that or understand that BRICS is a very different international institutions compared to the other existing ones. First, it's an open and inclusive institutions, despite the other differences between member countries in terms of political system, cultural tradition, religion, level of economic development. And secondly, they are all joining the equal footing. The relationships are equal. It's not like some alliances on Earth right now. There's always a leader in the relationship. It's equal, it's open. Third, and the people who join in, the countries who join this institution is for cooperation and development. It's not for confrontation. There's no so-called security or military elements at all in the BRICS. It's all coming to join hands, to develop for their own well-being. So those makes these institutions so different from some of the existing ones. Given that, I think other members who join this institution, of course, are working first and foremost for their own interests. They believe that being a member of the institution will be good for their development, both in terms of political stability and the economic growth. And secondly, they believe that joining these institutions will provide them with a platform to more effectively and clearly express their interests and demands on Earth. Last but not the least, of course, they can come together to make sure not only they join force, join hands in economic development, but if necessary, they can also help each other to make their society, the country, and the state more stable and more safe, given that we're in a world of great uncertainty. So I believe, having said that, I also agree with the previous panelists that we have to be very careful to accept the new members, not only because we do not want to overload these growing institutions, but we also have to reach certain consensus among the five founding countries to make sure that we will not go against each other on joining of the new memberships, because there are some discussions or difference on that. So this is a balance that has to be kept. But having said all that, I do believe the BRICS will expand, will have to expand. This is inevitable, and will be good in terms of global development and stability.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of this inclusiveness, I have to cite what has been said by President Xi Jinping in the 14th BRICS summit last year. He said, quote, "BRICS countries gather not in a closed club or an exclusive circle, but a big family of mutual support and a partnership for win-win cooperation." So Professor Paul Tembe, so it sounds like the principles or vision or even motto of this group of developing countries which is open, which is inclusive, which is not seeking confrontation, is about cooperation. What do you make of that?
Yes. Well, thank you very much that you began with me on this particular question, because then it puts two angles here, angles that I always think about when I think about organizations like BRICS. BRICS is a pioneer of bringing those who were previously at the periphery into the center of the world system. Now, if we agree with that, we have an issue here. The issue is BRICS itself, with other amalgamations that are emerging, they are forming a new system. It's not an alternative to the Western institutions, it's something new. So where does that bring us then? We were talking about consensus of the BRICS member countries, or consensus of those ones who are going to join on why we shouldn't do it so fast. This brings us to another thing, what is the issue of hierarchies of the world. This will lead me to cross-cultural communication. Now, the statement that you have just read from President Xi Jinping, that will then serve as a foundation. But what is most important there is that each and every BRICS member state has to find its own way of interpreting it. As we say that BRICS has got no leader. It's a consensus. It's a platform for cooperation and not for competition. So as wise as the words of President Xi Jinping, scholars like us, myself, for example, in South Africa, it will be then my role to interpret this statement, because it serves actually as a blueprint on how the modus operandus of BRICS, on how these different countries, Brazil, Russia, India, will cooperate with each other.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of that, of course, there's a concern, let's say, in particular from Western countries. I have a question for Mr. Dalakoti. Here I have have to use these numbers. According to Bloomberg, the BRICS countries they are outpacing in terms of their global growth contribution. They are surpassing that of the Group of Seven or G7 countries, based on IMF figures. In fact, BRICS is expected to contribute over 50% of global GDP by 2030. So there's a concern. Of course, here BRICS, they are not here to replace any existing institutions, but there is a concern. For example, G7 will be overshadowed by BRICS groupings. I wonder, what do you make of that? Say, does that mean G7 countries are becoming less relevant in the future?
It's a very good question. I think the BRICS countries have been growing, even though the COVID pandemic has slowed the growth substantially. It should be a temporary phase. This has not stopped more countries, wanting to join us, as we were talking. At present, the BRICS represents a total population of about 42% of the world, with 24% of the GDP and 16% of international trade. But from these numbers, we can quite understand that even though the numbers are huge, but there is huge potential of more growth among these 5 countries. So as you very rightly said, that the Bloomberg is saying that it's going to be going to make G7 irrelevant in a sense. But the basic difference of the perspective between the G7 and the BRICS countries are that G7 is trying to protect its legacy of economic development and is always seeing over its shoulder as the BRICS countries narrow the economic divide with them. As the influence of the BRICS countries increases, it is one way or the other affects the G7 countries' stature and economic control and brings new country to the high table of being the bigger economies, having more impact on the world affairs. Whenever the old order has to give way to the new one, there is resistance. But then these trends are inevitable as we will see the BRICS economies becoming more powerful and mature in the years to come. And it would really mitigate a formation of a new set of countries to be called the G7 of the future. These are interesting times for countries like India and China, which are much bigger economies than the past and demand recognition and a seat on the high table. Hopefully, this transformation would be peaceful and the G7 would allow the emerging countries to join and be part of the main group.
Mm-hmm. The vision and the prospect. And Mr. Andrey Kortunov, when we talk about this upcoming summit, President Putin accepted the invitation to join this summit, but ultimately agreed to stay online. Will his absence in any way affect this summit or probably the results, outcome of this summit?
Well, of course, personal presence and personal participation in the face-to-face format has its unquestionable advantages because a lot here depends on the chemistry between particular leaders. On top of that, if you're present in person, you can have important side meetings on the margins of the multilateral discussions. And this is something that apparently the Russian leader will not have. However, I'm sure that he will make a presentation at the BRICS summit. And on top of that, he has dispatched Mr. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, to replace him in Johannesburg. So I think that Russia will be visible there, and I'm sure that Russia will be actively engaged in discussions at the summit and also after the summit.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, this to continue this subtopic on this, Russia-Ukraine crisis conflict here, Mr. Ricardo, we know that at the very beginning we mentioned that a little bit. The global South, basically, in particular, these 5 large developing countries of BRICS grouping, they have taken rather neutral stance in terms of this conflict, which is different from Western countries. And of course, there's a pressure on them to follow the US and the European countries to impose sanctions, for example, on Russia. Does that make them somehow, there's maybe a division or, a big difference, say, in terms of cooperation or the future cooperation with the West?
Well, BRICS, the BRICS countries, they are trying always to seek for the global, the world peace. In terms of this inclusive multilateralism and joint efforts to provide a community with a common shared future for humankind. They have been daily debated and constructed by the BRICS members countries in order to always to reach at its utmost a fair, equitable, peaceful, and global order built upon the spirit of openness, inclusiveness, mutual respect, and as well as the love for the Mother Earth. The discussions that are comprised of this BRICS summit. It's for sure it will be about adhering to this concept of fairness and justice, maintaining this multilateral international pattern. But I mean, an inclusive multilateralism. An example of that was that a lot of developing countries felt they have been forgotten during COVID era, especially during this health crisis. It's also important to highlight the promotion of economic transformation, deepening inclusive and balanced development, deepening think tank comparisons, for example, gathering consensus on modernization, and for sure adhering also to mutual learning among civilizations, jointly promoting stable and far-reaching BRICS development, which are the backbones debates for the development of the BRICS countries. As stated before, BRICS represents 41% of the total population, which gives over 3 million people market. And the 5 BRICS countries combined, it's equivalent, roughly speaking, to 25.8% of the total world GDP. So again, I always highlight that the BRICS countries are gaining muscles and now having voice, including to promote the world peace.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Ricardo, just a follow-up, part of this, we say there's imbalanced representation of this growing large developing countries in, for example, existing financial institutions like IMF or World Bank. And then, of course, there's also issue of currency. For example, President Lula da Silva in April, when he visited his new development bank in Shanghai, he said, I quote, "We need a currency that gives countries more calm, because today a country needs to run after the dollar, the US dollar, to be able to export when it could export in its own currency." So there's an ongoing discussion to see whether there will be a common currency among the 5 countries, the BRICS countries, so they can have an alternative to US dollar to reduce their reliance on the US dollar. So what's the justification and where are we now?
Well, that's a very good point. Honestly speaking, if you compare the summits that have been organized so far since 2008, this summit is one of the most challenging ones, especially about this BRICS plus the countries that want to join the BRICS, and also because of the use of the replacement of the US dollar. I'm going to give an example for that before telling about this R5. This R5, these currencies of the 5 Rs, which Brazil is the Brazilian real, Russia, the ruble, India, the rupee, China, the renminbi, and also South Africa, which is the rand. So real, ruble, rupee, renminbi, and rand. There's a long way for us to discuss how we're going to implement this unique way of replacement of US dollar. But if you see, for example, the bilateral ties between Brazil and China, China and Brazil have established the diplomatic relations in 1974. And now we are reaching a far comprehensive strategic partnership in which one of the pillars of this Sino-Brazilian relationship in the new era is the use of renminbi, the yuan, the Chinese yuan, in the commerce, in trade between Brazil and China. So I'm not against using the US dollar on trade, but what President Lula highlighted and what BRICS members will definitely discuss will be how we can have alternatives for not being so dependent on the use of the US dollar. So again, this 5R or this R5 model is really interesting, but it has a long way to be discussed and see how we're going to implement that effectively, as successful as we are doing between Brazil and China with the use of the Chinese yuan.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Andrey Kortunov, of course, because of this Western sanctions on Russia, and in particular the financial sanctions. And Russia probably is a member which has this real experience and of over reliance on the use of U.S. dollars. I mean, you have to find an alternative to continue this international trade. Tell us, the experience and why it's necessary probably to push, at least for some countries, in fear of economic coercion or sanctions from Western countries. Probably you want to do something to prepare for the worst.
Well, it's clear that if you depend too heavily on a single currency, you expose yourself to various risks and contingencies, and that includes not only sanctions, which are clearly one of the most clear manifestations of this dependency, but it also means that financial institutions that can have a very serious impact on your future are beyond your control. So I think that it is only natural to diversify the currency basket. I think that in certain areas, for example, the Russian-Chinese trade, a lot of this trade, the majority of transactions are already conducted in national currencies, and this trend should go on. I don't want to underestimate the power of the US dollar. I think it's not just the currency itself, but it is also a system of international financial organizations which are behind the US dollar. And definitely it's a long process. And I think that one should not oversimplify these de-dollarization trends that we experience right now. But it is also clear that it's not fair that one country controls the global financial system. The United States can simply print more money and transfer the inflation costs on its partners. And this is something that has to be changed sooner or later. So I think that we are in the very beginning of a long process, but definitely this trend will continue.
Huang, so this is the beginning of a long-term process, but it's a process probably we need to start to do something. And for a lot of countries, especially for China, for example, given these tensions between Beijing and Washington. So what's the Chinese perspective in terms of having some alternative to US dollars?
I think the largest trading power on earth, China, of course, need a global financial stability to do trade. But on the other hand, we should say that it is not the BRICS countries to some extent. It is the United States itself trying to push the dollar out by weaponization of dollars for political means and political interests, which force the others, to join them, even though it's against their interests. That's one point. The other point, just like Andrew just said, the United States try to, by printing monies, do the inflations, try to harvest the others' economy, try to let others shoulder the inflation or other economic burdens which created by United States itself. So on this part, we should see that it is not just the BRICS countries or other countries try to de-dollarize in the economic exchanges or economic activities. It's United States which has been too bullish in using the dollars, not only as a military or economic weapons, but also as political weapons to achieve its so-called hegemonic goals. But on the other hand, I also agree that this process is inevitable, although it's a long process. For starting point, we know that we need an anchor for the so-called currency that has to be created, a new currency that has created. This anchor will be gold, or be something else, or be RMB. Secondly, we need all the joining countries have a quite transparent economy so that we know exactly where we stand in establishing a new currency. Last but not the least, of course, we are living in a global village. We cannot do without each other. This economic interdependence, I do not believe that can be decoupled because it's not created by any country's strategy or politics. This globalization, economic globalization, was the make of the market forces. And so we're all together. As a result, if we really want to create a BRICS currency, we have to consider how we can establish a meaningful relationship with other currencies, especially US dollars and the euros, in terms to maintain a kind of stability necessary for us to develop. to develop. After all, I think that as developing countries, a necessary condition for all the BRICS countries to sustain their development is stability. That's why this Ukraine conflict was so critical. Of course, we have different explanations and narratives how this conflict was started and how it should be end, more importantly. But on that, in short, my conclusion is that number one, this process is inevitable, it's necessary. Number two, it's a long process. Number two, and number three, last but not the least, we really have to establish a healthy and meaningful relationship with the existing currencies on Earth, so that we can, be kind of benefits to all of us. After all, again, we're living in the same global village.
Well, we have a few minutes left. We'll start with Professor Paul Tembe. As a host countries, what are the priorities for this upcoming summit, and what is the goal? What South Africa plans to achieve out of this summit meeting?
I think South Africa first is enjoying the ride, so to speak, because of representation. It places South Africa at the center of the world. And as the importance of BRICS might change the global financial system, for South Africa to be a locus of that, South Africa is going to gain a lot. Now, here is a problem. I'm the one who talked about amalgamation of banks. First, we've got different types of ownerships. South Africa has got a specific kind of ownership because of its history. India has got a specific type of ownership. So does China, Brazil, and Russia. So I think South Africa, what is going to be pushing forward, it is to use the BRICS as a bridge to a new type of ownership in South Africa that will then enable South Africa to push forward and be at par with other member states of BRICS. Because the disparities that exist in terms of ownership and in terms of running financial system might work as a disadvantage for South Africa as BRICS becomes bigger. So I think South Africa is looking at not using BRICS, but take the opportunity and the advantage of it hosting this magnitude financial paradigm shift for it to restructure its own financial systems. At least that's what I wish. Beyond that also, what I've mentioned, BRICS is going to also serve as a blueprint for establishing a new form of communication amongst BRICS member states, which is not a top-down, which is partnership of equals. That's what South Africa is gunning for. Financial and its role in the geopolitical landscape.
Better communication in this geopolitical landscape. Okay, final words for BRICS as a grouping and also this upcoming summit. I'll start with Huang Jing.
I think BRICS has a great future. It has a great future not only because it all belongs to the global south, but because it represents a growing force, and I think to a large extent a very healthy force in today's world. Because despite all the differences, the BRICS countries are all for peace, stability, and development. And this is first. Second, I think that as we are growing together, I think there will be a larger and a larger voice and representatives of global south in global affairs. Last but not the least, of course, the global south, despite its growing power, never want a confrontation with the global south. Instead, it want to have a better and more meaningful and cooperative relationship with global south. This is quite different from the experience we had before. That is, if you're getting stronger, you won't be bullish. You want to even enslave others. So this is never ever in BRICS DNA. It was never ever in BRICS agenda. We want peace, and we believe peace has to be based on cooperation. We want development, and we believe development has also be based on global kind of cooperation. I think the global south will be a very positive and strong forces in global governance, global government that we all needed for a better future.
Well, peace, development, stability, cooperation. And Mr. Ricardo.
Well, besides peace, development, and this cooperation, I'm very excited to attend and watch the discussion of this summit in South Africa, especially because of these three pillars of technology, sustainability, and also inclusiveness. And it's going to be a huge opportunity for us to discuss about the sustainable reindustrialization, including the situation of Brazil in this exchange. The innovation driven is an important tool for modernization and transformation of the industry, the promotion of inclusive economic growth, facilitation of the decision-making process, and the simulation of the national economies to meet the 2030 agenda for sustainable development goals. So I'm very excited to hear the discussion, not only in terms of the world peace, the use of the currencies, but also in terms of this technology, this sustainability and inclusiveness pillars.
Sustainability and inclusiveness. Mr. Andrey Kortunov?
Well, let me say that in Johannesburg, they will have the 15th summit of the BRICS group. As an international institution, BRICS is a teenager. And when you're a teenager, it's appropriate to experiment, to take certain risks, and maybe to change your priorities from time to time. But I do hope that at this summit, the BRICS countries will make a major step towards adult life, towards maturity. I think that the time has come for BRICS to become a more mature institution.
More mature institution. What are the key words for you, Mr. Atul Dalakoti?
The Indian Prime Minister has on various occasions talked about the importance of the global South to escape the cycle of dependence on systems and circumstances which are not of our making. This is quite visible in the foreign policy initiatives that are being taken by the Indian government, especially the outreach to Asia, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. I really hope India and China should work together to champion the issues of global South. With a combined population of 2.4 billion people, representing the economic engines of growth of the world, these two countries combined can help in safeguarding the interest of the global South and work together for a more equitable economic development. The growth of the South needs a free market and a continuation of the trend of globalization to be able to meet the common desires of the people to have a more prosperous life. BRICS is a very important organization to achieve these ends.
Thank you, Mr. Dalakoti, and many thanks to all of you for your time and insights. With that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks again to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.